Welcome to the Creative Ticket Podcast, brought to you by Pacific Video and hosted by Geraldo Rodriguez. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast has been originally created, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today. Today, I have the pleasure of talking to Paris Rosemont. Paris is an Asian Australian poet whose work has been published in many literary journals. She's been awarded multiple times. She's published this wonderful book that I have in my hands, The Banana Girl, and she is here to talk us about her career and her inspirations and her artistic process. Welcome, Paris. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. You're most welcome. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Thanks for inviting me along.
So just so that our listeners can understand how we met, you were performing at the Short and Sweet Theatre Festival with a wonderful monologue called Banana Girl. Can you tell me how you came up with the idea of Banana Girl and how you turned it into a performance?
Yes, well, I'm actually a poet, so I'd never written a script before. And Short and Sweet is a mini play festival, so they're 10-minute plays that are staged for the duration of the festival. But I had this idea where I could potentially meld the art forms of poetry and theatre. And I did that by sort of splicing 3 of my poems that were already in my debut poetry collection and interspersing that with some dialogue. So it sort of enabled me to expand my work because poetry is very condensed in its form. What you say is very distilled, and sometimes it's a little bit abstract as well. And so by sort of developing it into a little one-woman play, it was essentially a monologue. It allowed me to expand on some of those ideas and to explain it a little bit further. And I I felt like a little bit of a cheat because I stitched together the poems to create the overarching story arc to tell this. It's pretty much an autobiographical tale of my background as an Asian Australian. I grew up in the 80s when the White Australia policy had just been abolished in the mid-70s. And so Asians in Australia were fairly new, and it was pretty difficult to integrate into a very white Australian society at the time. Immediately I was sort of seen as different, and I felt like I always had to struggle a little bit and work a little bit harder than my Anglo peers just to be regarded as equal. And because of that, I developed a kind of self-loathing in a way, which was terrible for me to look back on myself as a child. I feel sorry for little me because, I was perfectly fine as I was, but I didn't feel like I was at the time. I hated myself, and it took me, decades to overcome that and to learn to accept who I am and not be ashamed of my background and upbringing. Sort of entangled in all of that are the stereotypes as well. So because Asians were fairly new to Australia at the time, and because Thailand in particular, which is my ethnicity of background, Thailand was only known as a sort of destination place where there were lots of prostitutes. And so it was a good time sort of destination where men were able to take advantage of the women there. And I felt really ashamed of that. Growing up, I felt like people didn't really know much about my country and culture, apart from the negative associations they had with it. But as an adult, rather than feel ashamed about all of that sort of stuff, I decided to confront it. And so in my play, Banana Girl, I actually tackled head-on some of the things that have been said to me over the years. And they're pretty disgusting misogynistic things that men have said either to me or in my presence. Very derogatory towards females, especially females of Asian ethnicity. So it really plays into those stereotypes, but rather than being weakened by those now, as I would have been in my teens or early 20s, I'm sort of confronting them and empowering myself to say, hey, this is what you might think of me, but I'm so much more than your stereotype.
What a wonderful beginning, Paris. Thank you for sharing all of that. Do you find that Australian culture is very misogynistic still?
I think it's moved on in a lot of ways, and it's much less misogynistic than it used to be. But it's still there. It still pervades society. I'm not sure that it's something that we're going to be able to move away from entirely in our lifetime. But we can take steps along the way to sort of bring to light certain inequities so that people can really make informed choices and be a little bit more aware of what's around them.
Amazing. I come from Brazil, which is a country that has many beautiful things, but has also this macho culture. And I find that there is a long way for men to walk, to go, until we as men are able to realize many of the things that women, especially poets and artists, are already seeing about society and about the way we relate to other fellow human beings.
Yes.
So thank you for so I find myself in a very privileged position to be able to be here and listen to your take, to your view on things.
Yes. Just on that
You were
note,
saying...
Sorry. I was going to sort of add to what you were saying before, in that I think a lot of societal change comes from the next generation. So we as parents can educate our children, our sons and our daughters, so that it will gradually, create the shift that we hope to see in future generations. So it's not something that's going to be instant, but if we sort of pass on our values to the next generation and they pass it on to, the next one after that and the one after that, then slowly we can move towards a better society.
Amazing. And you were saying before that poetry is all about concisiveness, is all about condensing the message into words,
yes,
into sentences. How did you get into into being a poet? How did you get into poetry?
I think, first of all, it came from a love of reading. So I've enjoyed poetry since I was in school and had to study it. And beyond study, I started reading it for my own personal pleasure, and I found there's a whole microcosm in a poem. Like you can sort of discover a whole world within one tiny piece, and that, I think, is incredible. Just the power to transform within such a short space of time. I really liked the power and intensity of poetry as a form, as opposed to longer form pieces of writing like a novel, where you're staying in it for hundreds of pages. So that's a very sort of slow burn, like building upon different characters and a storyline and this and that. A poem, it hits you in the guts. So it really makes you feel, and that's what I really like about it, just the emotiveness of poetry. I think we've got such an overstimulation of input these days that I think we can become desensitized to some of it. But where I think poetry really hits the mark is that it reaches the core of who we are as humans. And so that, I find, is really beautiful. And so I started as a reader and then sort of eventually started writing myself. I suppose it came out of journaling, so diary writing. I started writing just little notes on things that were happening in my life, and I was thinking, this is actually something that is fairly poetic in what I'm trying to say. Why don't I actually try to write poetry? And so 2 years ago, I enrolled in my first little course, and it was an instant love. It was something that I hadn't really considered, because you sort of get buried by your career and vocation, your profession and practicalities of life. So for me, it was motherhood. All of that sort of overshadowed my sort of personal pleasure in a way. So I was just doing a lot of things for other people. And I forgot to sort of pursue my own personal interests and passions until sort of things changed in my life. There was a lot of overhaul. COVID hit. My family needs had changed. My kids were older, and their needs were changing. And I thought, okay, it's now's the time for me to make that choice. Do I want to keep on living this life in a boring office job that I'm really not very happy in? Or do I do what I've wanted to do for my whole life but never dared to, because I didn't think it was something that you could actually do as a living, because to be perfectly honest, you don't make money from it. It's really hard to scrape together a living to do it. But it was something that just kept calling me. And so I thought, I'm going to do it. What's the point of living a life just, a life so practical that your dreams die? So I left my office job, and I decided to try writing. I gave myself 1 year. So I said to myself, you've got 1 year to try this writing thing. You might be successful, you might fail. Either way, you will know, how it goes, to put in your best effort and see where you land. So I really tried hard. I enrolled in, little 6-week courses at a time. I enrolled in this thing called a WestWords Academy, which was the crucial turning point for me, because there are a lot of writing courses that teach you the craft of poetry, but not actually organizations that tell you in practical terms how to be a writer. So they taught me things such as, you as a writer, if you're serious about writing, you need a social media presence, because you need to not hide behind, a screen or your books. You need to become somebody that the public can engage with, so that they will want to buy your books or they will want to come to your events. And I thought about this for a while, because prior to a couple of years ago, I was a very private person. I didn't share, any pictures of myself online at all. I kept that very sort of hidden from the public eye. But I was serious about becoming a writer. So I sort of saw it as part of my job. And I started posting every single day to sort of stay relevant to the algorithm. And it sounds a little bit clinical, but I've actually built a community around it. I enjoy the people that I've made connections with, and it's a fun part of what I do. Amazing.
And so many things to ask you. I'm going to start with, from a love of writing, you went to becoming a lawyer, am I correct, before you turned into a poet?
Yes. So after school, the choices that were posed to me at the time were either you become a lawyer or a doctor. If you've got fairly good grades at school, they were your two options. And I'm not keen on the whole sciencey sort of thing, so I thought, okay, I'm pretty good at English, and so law was pretty much the option served up to me as the sort of sensible career choice. And so that was 5 years of my life studying, and then I became a graduate solicitor after I graduated, and I hated every moment of it, because it is such a cutthroat industry. You have to really want to be there. You have to really have your eye on the prize, being you want to claw your way up to becoming a partner in the firm, to doing certain things that I would personally regard as a little bit unethical. That's a very sort of controversial thing, but I just didn't feel good doing them myself personally. I couldn't do them. And so I decided to step aside from work in a law firm to work for the government for a while. So that's where I spent the majority of my working life. About 15 years I spent as a judge's associate. And that I felt more comfortable doing, because I felt like I was a small cog in the bigger wheel of doing some good for society. Because I was working for the judge is always trying to work in the best interests of the parties who are coming before them in court.
Amazing. And thus, did that experience influence your writing in any way, or is it something that you regard as separate from the material you use to write your poetry?
I feel that most of it is quite separate. It was quite a clinical style of writing, so I would compile a lot of evidence in what I did. I'd be in court every day listening to the evidence before me, summarizing it, laying out drafts for judgments, and so it was a little bit sort of creative in that way, in that I would actually write the story of the people who were appearing before us in court. But there was no sort of creativity in that. It was just, I had to regurgitate the facts in a very sort of pretty way that would read sort of smoothly and easily. So I utilized my writing skills in a very different way there. But I think where it surfaces in some of my writing, even today, is in the subject matter. Because I thought that working where I did, I was able to clock in, clock off, and leave my work behind me when I left the office at the end of the day. But when you're listening to, well, I worked in family law, so they were children's cases. When you're hearing, about child abuse, about drug abuse, about domestic abuse of women, children, there's no way you can leave that behind you completely. You take parts of that away with you. And that's partly why I left the courts, because it was slowly eroding me and bringing me down emotionally to work in that sort of environment of such toxicity, in terms of the people who would come in. They were so emotionally charged, and it's just a very difficult sphere to work in, emotionally. And so that has surfaced in a couple of my poems. I've written some works about the abuse that I heard about. It hasn't been easy subject matter to write about, but I also felt it was important to give people voices. So they're not my personal lived experiences, but I feel like sometimes I sort of help speak for those who have been disempowered by their circumstances. So the women who were battered, the children who were abused. Because it's important that it's not sort of shoved away and hidden from society, because this is happening and it shouldn't be.
Perfect. And when you say that we as a poet, your work is to condense, to get the emotion or the meaning or the story you want to tell through your poetry into a very condensed form. Did you work it? I'll rephrase myself. When you get to the point where you know what you must do, as in saying, I must condense what I want to say, does it get easier? Or is the matter of the poetry always something you have to struggle a little bit to understand what is it you have to say, what is it you want to say? Or does it become easier with time?
I think it really depends on the piece. In general, I think it becomes easier with time. It's like practice, and the more you do something, the easier it becomes. But each individual poem is different in itself, and so you'll sort of come with different challenges with each of them. Some of them, for me, have flowed out really quickly and easily, and it surprises me the way I sort of consider it almost like one of those home births where you're not quite ready and the baby just slips out on the floor sort of thing, and that's like, whoa, it's done already. But then other ones, you're in labor, for 24 hours, and you've got these cramps and it's not coming, and you're sort of working on it. And so some poems are quite difficult in that way, in that you still have to work on it and craft it, and something's not quite clicking together with it. With those ones, sometimes I just put them aside for a while, because there's something blocking it. And so I will refresh myself, do something else entirely, and then revisit it another day, just with a fresh lens, a clearer mind, to see whether I see poetry almost like a puzzle. So I come back to it and see whether I can figure out, the perfect combination to make it work.
It's amazing. You're telling that it gets easier with time, and I imagine how much you still have to write, because if you've been doing this, of course, you've been writing for your whole life, but you've been doing poetry for 2 years. Mm-hmm. I imagine how much you're still to write.
Yes.
And it's very exciting. And what triggers a poem for you? What makes you start a poem? Is it an emotion? Is it something that you need to share? Is it something that you want to let the world know? Do you mind the world, the people that are going to read when you're writing? Or at first it's just your own process, your own way of putting things down on paper?
With my first book, Banana Girl, a lot of that was very autobiographical. And so there were lots of things that I wanted to say and express. And I found poetry to be a really good vehicle for expressing certain components of my life that I wanted to get out. And so that sort of provided its own material without me really having to think. I was feeling a lot of it, and so I was just sort of almost like a butterfly net. I was just catching the little butterflies as they came across and sort of harnessing each one for its potential. Now that I've written that, it's sort of where to from there. So I now draw my inspiration from experiences that are unfolding around me. So that's why I like to go on creative residencies, because that will put me in a different environment that I'm not usually in, and that will help sort of the creative juices flow in a different way, because I will have different sort of external stimulation. So people walking past, for example, I'll see, somebody with headphones on, and that will sort of remind me of something that's happened, in my past. And so I'll start sort of working on that. Or I might see the relationship between two people as they're walking past. And that sort of is something that I can grab onto and write about. So my most recent residency was in Ireland. It was actually my very first international writers residency, which was super exciting. And whenever I go on residencies, I never really know whether I'll be able to produce anything. So there's a slight sort of nervousness in that respect, in that there's never any pressure placed on the organizers for us to produce. But it's always nice to be able to have something by the end of our time there. And so this one, the country was so beautiful. It's so natural and unspoiled. So you've got that backdrop of the ocean, the coastline there. It's wild, it's rugged. So I drew upon the inspiration there. We had a full moon one night, which was just glimmering over the water just outside the room I was staying in. So that inspired a piece for me to write. And Ireland has such a rich culture. It's so steeped in folklore and tales of, love and loss and those sorts of things. So I was able to draw upon that culture and sort of incorporate that into the pieces that I was writing. And so I was really pleased with the poetry that I was able to produce there, because, like I said, there's never a guaranteed outcome when you go somewhere. You hope you'll get inspired by the place. And when you do produce something, and the pieces that I created there are markedly different from the other pieces that I've written before. And so that's a sort of almost like a little souvenir that I can take home with me of something that's quite different and special in my little writing career.
Amazing. And I find it really interesting how artistic residencies happen for a multitude of different arts: painting, writing, performing arts. Do you find that being around artists working on their craft inspires you? Is that sort of change, is that a sort of exchange important for you as an actor? Or do you draw inspiration from from thin air,
Oh,
out of thin air.
it's definitely enriching to be around a creative community, because otherwise our work is in such isolation. Writing is all in my head. And so I need to get out of my head sometimes. So I need to talk to other creatives and just to see what their process is like and what inspires them, and seeing their actual work. Sometimes we bounce off each other. So sometimes I will write a piece and then somebody will say, oh, like, can I try playing some piano underneath your poetry? Because I feel like, you know, we can sort of do a little bit of a crossover collaboration. And that's just a really wonderful sort of organic extension of each other's work, really. And yeah, I find it incredibly inspiring to be around other creative people, because there's a certain energy about being around creatives. And we're sort of uniquely placed in that we understand each other, like we understand our respective struggles, how difficult it is to forge a living out of our art. Art is sometimes seen as a little bit of a luxury these days, because it's not an essential thing that keeps us living and breathing. But I would argue that in ways it is. It's essential to our soul. And without that, we get depressed, and what is the point of life otherwise, if not to bring beauty and happiness to it?
And do you find that your poetry has changed during the years you've been writing? Or did you actually start 2 years ago, or did you write before but you didn't consider it poetry, or you didn't consider it that it could be a living? You said you had journals growing up?
Mm-hmm.
Is that so?
Yes.
The,
Sort of beyond.
and did the way you write change? Sorry, go for it.
Yeah, so beyond school, I didn't really write all that much. There were the occasional journals here and there, but I wouldn't really consider that writing. It was just like a teenager writing in her diary sort of thing, just for fun, just for like, oh, I'm so important, I need to document everything that's happening because it's, you know, so has such impact on the entire world and society, whereas really it's just, you know, teenage angst playing out on paper. But so I actually just started writing a couple of years ago. That's when I put pen to paper and decided I want to try writing poetry and see how it goes. And the first poems I wrote were pretty bad, to be honest. I thought I was pretty okay at it at the time. And so I enrolled in my first course, and I just realized how much more there was to learn. But rather than sort of get disheartened by it, I found it a challenge. I found it exciting to know that there was so much more ahead of me that I could potentially explore. And I became ravenous to sort of fill in the gaps that I hadn't had before, like in my knowledge of poetic form and craft, to be specific, because I was very much free form in my writing before. But when I learned sort of the different forms that I could play around with, I thought, oh, these are actually really handy tools. Doesn't mean that I have to use them in every poem that I craft, but they're useful to draw upon if they serve a purpose for a particular poem that I'm writing. So I have seen my style and my poems develop over the last couple of years. I would like to think that I've matured in my style, and that this next collection that I'm working on is perhaps a little bit more elegant and refined than my first one. My first one was quite experimental, and so it was quite, vivid and vibrant in its style, which was me at the time, and I'm really proud of the work that I created. But that said, I am also proud of the personal growth that I've been through, and I think my next book will reflect that.
Amazing. When you say that you grew to learn the forms, you grew to learn to work on the forms, and that it helped you, do you find that the technique, the being able to master a form is more of a freedom choice, is more of a freedom opportunity than a restraint opportunity? Or is the restraint something that allows you to create?
I think you've really hit the nail on the head with this one, because it is the restraint of the form, because some of them are so tight in their syllable structures or rhyme schemes that you have to be very controlled in the way it comes out. And that can be a really good technique to employ when, for example, you've got really emotive subject matter. So when emotions are running high, the elegance and restraint of a form can really harness the emotions so that they don't just explode all over the page. They have this sense of control within this uncontrolled undercurrent.
Amazing. I'm going to share with you that after I started reading your book, I thought to myself, I really don't know how to speak. I don't know how. It's not that I don't know how to write. I don't know how to speak. It's not that I don't know how to speak English, because English is my second language. But I realized that perhaps I don't even know to speak Portuguese, which is my first language, because there are so many things that I don't know about myself, and so many things that I cannot say about myself. And I find that being able to write poetry is not just about being alphabetized. It's not just about being able to write. It's about being able to write about something and communicate something. And it actually inspired me to start writing, not as a profession, as in a professional way like you do, but just for myself, for me to experiment on that language that I don't speak, which is my own language, which is my own.
Yeah, I think sometimes we're sleepwalking through life, and we sort of just draw upon normal sort of conversational language that is around us, but we're often afraid to confront ourselves. And that's, I think, where poetry comes in. Poetry digs deep and it hits hard. A lot of it's uncomfortable because it's stuff that we wouldn't talk to, our family or friends about, because it's too unpleasant sometimes. But when you're just writing for your own self, and I think you sort of touched upon this earlier in that, the subject matter, is it sometimes a little bit difficult to write about certain subject matter, and what about if people see it or read it, that sort of thing. First of all, I always write for myself. I don't write with a view to, sharing it or publishing it or any of that. That comes later on if I choose it. And so writing for me is a very safe space. I can be free to create in any way I want to, and I don't need to be polite. I don't need to censor myself when I'm writing. That can come in the edits later on if I want to do that. But my very first drafts are really raw. They're, my innermost thoughts and feelings without any sort of censors or any overlays of societal expectations or constructs placed on top of them. And so that's really liberating in so many ways. And you're right in that I don't feel like I knew myself before this, because I hadn't given myself the language to express myself in the way that I have. By putting conscious thought into crafting my poetry, I've really got to know myself a lot better.
And you use a Japanese form, a Korean form. You use the sonnet, which is, let's say, an English form. How do you go about these different forms? Do you find that they apply to a specific subject matter, or they apply to a specific way of writing, way of choosing what you want to talk about? Or is it it doesn't really matter? The form will just be used as could be used for a lighter poem, for a happy poem, just as it could be used for a darker, a sad poem.
I don't let the form limit the subject matter, and in fact, that's one of the things that I enjoy playing with. Using very traditional forms, but being playful with the subject matter. So things that wouldn't have been done in the centuries where those forms were created, putting a contemporary feel on it is something that I enjoy doing, just because I think it's something a little bit different, there are certain forms that I feel lend themselves to certain voices or styles of writing. I was looking at one of my poems the other day. It was a rubaiyat, which is an old Persian form. And that one has a very specific rhyme scheme. And on top of that, I added a rhythm to it as well. It's called iambic pentameter, which is also one that's employed in a sonnet. And so those rhythms and rhymes combined are very musical and lyrical. And so that often lends itself to love poetry, for example, just because of the beauty of the rhymes that are, it's almost serving you the beauty of love. And so they're often a good pairing, those sorts of forms with those sorts of topics. That said, I've written sonnets which are very contemporary in feel. So sonnets, people would be familiar with Shakespeare, for example. He wrote, heaps of sonnets that are very beautiful, flowing, lyrical. And so what I like to do with mine, because they do have that beauty, the innate beauty of the language and the rhyme that's in there, I play with the form and twist it so that it's something really different and contemporary. So, for example, one of my sonnets is about a blow-up doll, and that would most definitely not have been used in Shakespeare's time. And that's actually where this is a good segue into how I came to do performance poetry as well. Certain poems of mine lend themselves to being performed on a stage because they're quite sort of expressive, and audiences are able to find resonance in the subject matter because it's not as sort of dry as reading it on the page, perhaps. Although I'm pretty aware of the fact that I want my poetry to stand as strong on the page as it does on the stage. So I work hard to craft both elements of my poetry.
In saying that, would you mind reading one of your poems if you feel comfortable and if you feel this is the time for you to read out one of your poems aloud?
Sure. This one's called I Even Think in Perpetua These Days. I felt the need to become more informed about birds so I could sprinkle them into my poetry instead of the glitter that comes in those little cylindrical tubes in a dozen dazzling colour pops. I've packed those away for now. No self-respecting poet would be caught dead with those. You told me after week 1 that I needed to be less sparkly. I had paid all my pretty pennies to be told to sparkle the fuck less. Sparkless. I realise now you've been trying to save me from my gaudy, blinged up like a Christmas tree, super sparkly self. But I don't take well to being told what not to do. So I ramped up my sparkle, sprinkled on so much sass that the fine dust of me caught in your eye. A tiny twinkle at first, the softest of glimmers, until your eyes shone with the reflection of me. I filled your vision quite maddeningly, drove you to distraction. Meanwhile, I threw some shade over my sparkle, so the glare wouldn't offend anyone's eyes should the sun have hit at the wrong angle.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Do you, when you read your own poetry, do you still see yourself, or does it feel like it belongs to a different time, to a different person, to someone else?
No. It all of my poems are like my little babies. They're all a part of me. They're part of the fabric of what creates me. So even though it's part of my past, you can never really leave your past. You'll carry it to your grave. So yeah, they all always travel with me.
I have this thing that I like to ask people about what they find, what they think that got them to this day. What do you think that inspired you to becoming a poet, if there was something alongside your family, if that was something of an internal process, or if you were always seeing the world in a different way, and then you thought, yeah, I really got to talk about it because I really need to put this out in the world. What is exactly that brought you to this?
I think it circles back to my childhood and my love of reading. I was a very quiet child. I'm still pretty quiet now as an adult, and I didn't have many friends. And so the books were my friends. I would spend my days reading, and I felt most comfortable when I was with my imaginary friends being the characters in the books. I was always inside my head dreaming, of all these fantastic worlds that I'd read about. And I was sure that there was a life beyond the life that I was living right here, right now. And I just had to find my way there one day. And so because of that, the magic that I felt from reading as a child, I feel like I'd always wanted to be able to express some of that in my own way as well. And so I think that's, it was probably something subconsciously that I had carried with me through my life, even though I didn't sort of do anything with it until very recently. That's what I would sort of say is what brought me to where I am today.
So in a way, you could say that the treasure was hidden from a young age.
Yes.
You had that treasure within you from a young age, and you found a way to express that same treasure now that you're a grown up, now that you have the resources, now that you have the courage, now that you have the world to talk to. That's really interesting. Yeah. And reading as a child was something that your parents supported you through. Were they suggesting that you read as much as you did as a child, or was it something that you found yourself reading because that was what you had to do?
No, it was just something. My parents are not really readers. They didn't enjoy reading themselves, and so it wasn't something that came from them, although they did encourage it because they thought it would make me smarter. And so being Asian, that's always a very big thing in the back of their minds. Oh, the more she reads, the smarter she'll be. So that's excellent that she enjoys reading. But I just enjoyed it personally, so much so that when I was in primary school, my school librarian had to ask me to leave the library at lunchtimes because she thought it was unhealthy that I was sitting by myself reading every day, and she thought I needed to socialize and play with the other kids. And so she said, I can't have you in here every day anymore. And I was devastated, but she was right. She had a point. And
going back a little bit to the residency, that this one that you did in Ireland was your first international residency.
Yes.
You've done a few residencies before. You've received a few fellowships before. Does that lead up to more work? Is that a way for you to feel supported in your writing, to participate in those residencies or fellowships or publishing houses, programs, and things like that? Is that a way for you to keep yourself engaged in your writing?
Yes, most definitely. They're wonderful stepping stones. So the very first residency I won was from the WestWords-Varuna Writers Residency for emerging writers. So that was in late 2022. Before that point, I had never had a writing mentor before, like a one-on-one mentor who would look at my work and sort of help sort of teach me what needed to be done next. And that was an amazing experience that I will say was probably the most pivotal point in my writing career. That very first mentorship. They partnered me with a Scottish-Australian poet, Ali Whitelock, and she was incredible. She's a wonderful poet herself, but she was just so generous with her time, with her advice. She made me feel like I I sort of, had talent, and to have that sort of validation from, a real life poet, for me, it was just amazing. And so she looked at several of my poems and helped to sort of, to flag the weak points in them. So she'd say, oh, this one's a bit of a cliche. You can find something more interesting to say that hasn't been said, 100 times before. And I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. And so she helped me be able to identify in my own writing without changing my voice. So everything remained sounding like I wanted it to sound, but just tighter. So, scrubbed away the excess. Sometimes I was packing too much into one poem, and she said, less is more. You don't need to say everything. If you get rid of this line and that line, what you do is you just make it flow a little bit better, more smoothly. So by the end of it, I was able to self-edit. So she had taught me the skills. It's like that, if you give a man a fish, he eats for a day. You teach a man to fish, he can eat for life. And that's what Ali did for me. She taught me the skills that I've moved forward with, and so I can work with, scrubbing and polishing. And sometimes I hear her voice in my head telling me, oh, you can do better than that. That's a bit lazy. And I know it is. Sometimes you just think you can get away with it. But she's like, you're not fooling anyone. If you think you can get away with something, you're not getting away with it at all. You're cheating yourself, and you know it. So she has taught me to be the best that I can be. So there's no laziness. I go through line by line every single piece, and there cannot be any weak points in it, because if there's anything that even I'm thinking, that's all right, I guess, then it really isn't all right.
So is there a recipe for being a poet, would you say? And if there is, what are the ingredients?
There's no one recipe to being a poet. I think first of all, passion. That's what got me, most of the way, where I am today. A passion for it, a love of the craft of language, and then a little bit of knowledge. So the skills, how to use the words, how to maximize their effect. I think there's also an auditory sort of element to it as well. I think there's a few people have said how musical my poetry is, and I think that's because I did play music as a child, and I think that comes across in the way I write. And so that's not necessary for all poetry and all poets, but for me, the musicality of the language and the words and the rhythm in my poetry is important. And then hard work. I mean, I work really, really hard. I work around the clock till late at night. I've never worked harder than I have when I've been a poet, because it just doesn't stop. You can go to an office, clock in, clock off at the end of the day. But as a poet, working for yourself, it's never ending. Your mind's always working, it's always thinking, and sometimes it's exhausting doing all of that thinking. And it's not just the writing of it. There's all these sort of supporting roles that being a poet encompass. So first of all, like this podcast that I'm doing right now, it's a sort of auxiliary event to being a poet. To getting myself out there, sharing my work, sort of being known as a poet. I do these sorts of things. I spend time every single day working on my social media, because again, it's about building a presence. And that has really helped me, because it's landed me some pretty good gigs along the way. So people who are sort of in charge of writers' events or festivals, for example, start looking at the people who are sort of, getting noticed on social media. And so sometimes I get contacted by people who say, oh, I've stumbled across your Instagram and I'd be interested in programming you in an, X and Y event, because they've seen that I do the performance poetry. And so the books don't actually make me much money at all. It's a bit of a fallacy in that respect. You think that, once you've got a book, then, that's it. You can, sit pretty, but it's the events that are actually my bread and butter. So that's what I work hard to try, and beyond the actual books, to try and to cultivate for myself, is the ongoing work that I can get through poetry events.
And Are you a mentor yourself? Are you mentoring anyone at the moment? Do you mentor other poets?
Sometimes I do. I sometimes run little workshops for the community. I've done library workshops for school groups, and I do private mentorships as well. So I tutor children and adults, both in written poetry, and for children, I help them with their speech, writing, and public speaking. For adults, I tutor them in performance poetry. So sometimes they like to go and compete in slams, for example. So I just run through that sort of thing with them, or I do written poetry, so on the page. And so as part of my current residency in Randwick at Barrett House, I've got this thing called Poet in the House, where I open my studio to members of the community. They can come in for an hour each week, just drop in as they please, and we just chat poetry. So whatever might be on their mind that's poetry related, if they want recommendations for writing prompts, or if they've written a poem that they want my feedback on, it's just a nice chance to connect with people in the community and to give back a little bit.
I might change a little bit the topic because I want to pick your brain on something. Mm-hmm. People have been talking about AI for quite a while now. And every time they talk about AI, they say AI is going to substitute the artists. Mm-hmm. The artists, not everyone, not all the other professions, but the artists. Do you find that's possible? Or is that desirable?
Definitely not desirable. Possible on the surface. So say, for example, I used to be a freelance copywriter for a while, and I don't do that anymore because one of my last clients said, oh, well, actually, I can get AI to do what you're doing. Like, wow, if you really think so, go for it. But the truth is, they could do that, and it would be pretty close to what I would be able to produce as a copywriter, because copywriting is for a very specific purpose. You're trying to sell a certain, business or product or something like that. So the writing is very clinical and targeted. But something creative, for example, I don't think that can ever be effectively outsourced to AI, because people are human. We need that human element to it, so that human connection, the human emotion behind it. AI can try and pretend to do it, and I think where AI will get it is the abstract poetry or bad poetry. So the really overdone, flowery sort of poetry that just lacks a certain sort of depth to it. I would like to think that AI couldn't effectively replace us, but the truth is a lot of people in the creative arts are worried. I've got a friend who I was on residency with recently. She's a Canadian, and she said she's a voiceover artist. She said that what they're doing now is, they're getting AI samples of her voice and then replicating that, which is obscene. They only need small grabs of a person's voice and they can use that. And yeah, it's a real worry in terms of the future of artists. But again, you think about the rise and fall of societies, and I think when there are certain lulls or crashes, it comes down to the basics. And so I think even if we're worried for a while, things will eventually come back again, because people value people. We need each other to survive. We need, people to propagate the human race and the humanness of who we are. What else is there if we're not the ones creating? I mean, AI should be used for the more automated things. Well, why don't we use AI to make things more functional in terms of the ease of our daily life? Outsource those tasks to AI, not the creativity. It just doesn't make sense at all.
And to add on that, I find that even if AI could create poetry, and even if the fact is not that we read poetry because of AI, we read poetry because we need to learn how to speak our own language. And I find that many times we only find that through someone else. We only find that when we have a conflict. We only find that when we fail, when somebody sees us failing, when we get things wrong, or when we achieve something, but someone celebrates with us. And I don't think that AI could substitute the sense of community, the sense of sharing. That film, the feature film, Her.
That was a good film
with Joaquin Phoenix. Yeah, but at the same time, it's such a lonely life.
Yes,
and
I think that's what comes across, doesn't it? It's at the end of it, it's hollow. It's not real. And I think what you've touched upon there is that it's about lived experience. And so AI hasn't lived, and so how can it have that lived experience that connects us? It doesn't.
Absolutely. Would you mind reading a second poem? And if you want to choose a different one, because I sent you the ones I chose.
That made it easy
but
for me.
there are many others that I would choose, because I find that, and before we read the next one, I find that there is a wonderful humor, a good humor that's witty, that's funny to your poetry. That
I'm glad
is
you
at the
think
same
so.
time. Yeah, it's at the same time honest. It's brutally honest, transparent, very sensual, very. How can I say? It's full of images, but at the same time, on top of that, there is lots of funny things. And do you consider yourself a funny person? Do you look at life through funny glasses? Are you the kind that smiles and laughs at what life brings you?
You know what? I would never call myself a funny person. If anything, I was, as a child, even my teachers regarded me as very serious. So I'm a very serious person in a lot of ways, but I think it's as I've grown up and matured as an adult that I've learned to lighten up a little bit, and so to not take myself so seriously. More than being funny per se, I would probably regard myself as quirky. So I'm a little bit peculiar, a little bit sort of, odd and different. So, if you call that funny, then sure, that's funny. But I do like to use humor in some of my poetry because, I don't know, that's how I see the world. The world has lightness and dark. And there is so much darkness in what we experience that I like that little thread of light running through it, just because, you can't have one without the other. They're two sides of the same coin.
That's true. So please, read your next poem.
This one, the title of it is actually the first line of it as well, so it just runs on through. So... The inevitable hangs between us like a third wheel. We try to ignore it, feigning lightness we don't feel. Pinot Noir washes down our bitter, sweet tomorrow. I rest my head on your shoulder. We gaze out at the setting sun. Your fingers absent-mindedly run through my hair. We breathe in the warm familiarity of each other. I want this image of us burned into my brain. So after you're gone, the sepia shadow remains in the dark room of my mind. My tears teeter, come close to tipping, my eyes oversized splash buckets at a water park. I blink away the tsunami until the Monet blur of pink and violet morphs into Carlo-esque choux-fleur clusters of hydrangeas. Prickly pears forest my legs, willows weep from my armpits. I drown in a tangle of mermaid tears.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Amazing. Some more claps around the room here. Paris, two final questions, two questions that I've been asking my guests. The first one is, what makes you you? If somebody saw you walking down the street or having a coffee at a cafe and saw you, what would they say? What do you think makes you you?
Wow, that's a really difficult question. I think my complexity, the fact that I can't be distinctly sort of identified or pinned down as something definable. One day I might be, quiet little Paris in cardigan and glasses. The next day I'll be Paris in my, thigh-high stiletto boots on stage, talking to a massive audience. You never really know what you're going to get, and I think that's a good summary of who I am. Unpredictable, a little bit volatile, a little bit, quirky. Yeah. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Are you Absolutely, yes. Are you unpredictable to yourself as well?
Yes.
Do you find that you are surprised by what you're doing?
Totally. I've done some things, this performance stuff, for example, because I'm really shy in real life. My personality is not sort of, the outgoing sort of type. And so for me to be able to do certain things, like when we met, you saw me do my Banana Girl monologue at the Short and Sweet Festival. That surprised me. The fact that I was able to pluck that out of, my internal reserves to do that in front of an audience, it was something so vulnerable. And I will say it was really brave of me to do that. So I surprised myself in being able to pluck that. Me who sits at home doing my writing, quiet little me was able to get up on a stage and perform in front of an entire audience. Yeah, I do surprise myself by some of the things. You never know until you give it a go. And I think that's part of what I do. Like I'm trying to go out of my comfort zone a little bit. So when people ask me to do things, sometimes I've never done it before, and I'll say, yes, sure, I'll do it. And so you never know how you're going to go until you try it. And so I think that by being open, things unlock for you. And I think, I've been incredibly lucky in the things that have opened up for me just because I've said yes. I've been willing to give things a go.
Amazing. And the last question is, I once thought about this screenwriting exercise where you take a picture of your main character one of your characters, and on that picture you put the things that person has strived for, like in the end of their life or by the end of the movie or by the end of the play, that person achieved all that they wanted, and we took a picture of them. What is there in that picture? If you had a picture taken of yourself on the end of your journey, at the end of your journey, at the end of your struggle, at the end of your life, what would be there in that picture with you?
Wow, this is going to show how sappy I am at heart. I would be there with the person I love in one of those little cocoon chairs, and I'd be snuggled on his shoulder, and we'd be looking out at a beautiful view. And that, to me, to be loved and to feel love for somebody else, that would be my life complete.
Amazing. That's so cute. That's so beautiful. That's so deep. This was Paris Rosemont. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Creative Ticket, Paris. If someone wants to buy your book or wants to hire you as a mentor or wants to invite you to speak in an event, how can they find you?
Just hop on my website. It's www.parisrosemont.com.
Perfect. There you go. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Creative Ticket podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to share this with your friends and family and subscribe so you can stay up to date with new episodes. feel free to reach out to hello@pacificvideo.com.au for feedback and suggestions. We would love to hear from you. Take care.